Sometimes the greatest strength comes wrapped in the most unexpected package. When Colonel Marcus Reed looked at Agent Sarah Chen that cold Tuesday morning, he saw nothing more than a 5'4" woman with tired eyes and trembling hands. What he couldn't see was the fire burning inside her soul, a fire that had been forged in the darkest corners of human suffering and tempered by years of silent preparation. In exactly 43 hours, this weak woman would single-handedly infiltrate the most secure black site facility in Eastern Europe, disable 14 armed guards, and lead 23 political prisoners to freedom. But right now, as Reed's mocking laughter echoed through the briefing room, Sarah simply nodded and walked away, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming. This is the story of how one woman's perceived weakness became her greatest strength, and how 43 hours can change not just lives, but the course of history itself. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the CIA briefing room as Agent Sarah Chen sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Around the polished oak table, 12 of the agency's most decorated operatives leaned forward, studying satellite images and floor plans spread across the surface. The target was clear, a black site facility hidden deep in the mountains of Montenegro, where 23 political prisoners had disappeared without a trace. Colonel Marcus Reed, a man whose chest bore enough medals to sink a small boat, stabbed his finger at the largest photograph. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been questioned, never been wrong, and certainly never been challenged by someone he considered inferior. "This is Facility 7, Reed announced, his steely grey eyes scanning the room. "Intelligence suggests our targets are being held in the underground levels. We need a team of our best operators for this extraction." Sarah had been studying the intelligence reports for 3 weeks. She knew every guard rotation, every blind spot in the security cameras, every ventilation shaft that led into the facility. She had memorized the layout so thoroughly that she could navigate it in complete darkness. When she raised her hand to speak, the room fell silent. "Colonel, I've identified a vulnerability in their eastern perimeter." The guard post there changes shifts at 0300 hours, leaving a 7-minute window where... Reed's harsh laughter cut through her words like a blade. "Chen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't a job for someone of your limitations." His eyes traveled down her small frame with obvious disdain. "These are hardened terrorists we're dealing with. They won't hesitate to put a bullet through your skull the moment they see you." The other agents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, with respect, I've studied this facility more than anyone else in this room. I know I can." "You can what?" Reed stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over the table. "You think because you can analyze satellite photos and write pretty reports that you're ready for real combat? This isn't a classroom exercise, Chen. This is life and death." Agent Thompson, a veteran operative with kind eyes, cleared his throat. "Marcus, maybe we should hear her out." Sarah's intelligence work on the Belgrade operation was exceptional. Reed's expression darkened. "Intelligence work? Exactly." He turned back to Sarah, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're good at sitting behind a desk, Chen. You're good at reading reports and connecting dots. But when bullets start flying and men twice your size are trying to kill you, what then? You think your college degree is going to save you?" Sarah's jaw tightened. She thought about her father, who had survived 3 years in a Vietnamese prison camp. She thought about her grandmother, who had smuggled Jews out of Nazi Germany while working as a seamstress. She thought about every person who had ever looked at her and seen only what they wanted to see. "I understand your concerns, Colonel," she said quietly, "but I believe I'm the right person for this mission." Reed leaned across the table, bringing his face close to hers. "You know what I see when I look at you, Chen?" "I see someone who's going to get my men killed. I see someone who's going to freeze up the moment things get rough. I see weakness." The word hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not breaking, but hardening, crystallizing. She had heard that word before, from teachers who thought she was too quiet, from boyfriends who wanted her to be someone else, from colleagues who assumed her politeness meant she lacked backbone. "Weakness," she repeated softly, tasting the word. "That's right," Reed continued, emboldened by what he mistook for surrender. "And weakness gets people killed in this business. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay here and analyze the intelligence we gather from the real operators, the ones who actually have what it takes to handle a mission like this." Sarah stood up slowly. She gathered her files and folders, stacking them neatly. Her movements were precise, controlled. When she spoke, her voice was so calm it was almost musical. "Thank you for your feedback, Colonel. I'll take it under advisement." She walked toward the door, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. Just before she reached the handle, she turned back. "For what it's worth, sir, I hope your chosen team succeeds. Those 23 people deserve to go home to their families." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Reed and the other agents in uncomfortable silence. Agent Martinez, a woman who had worked with Sarah on several previous operations, shook her head. "Marcus, you might have just made a mistake," she said quietly. Reed waved dismissively. "The only mistake would be putting someone like her in harm's way. Now, let's get back to planning this operation properly." But outside in the hallway, Sarah Chen was no longer the same person who had entered that briefing room. As she walked past the portraits of fallen agents that lined the corridor, she made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her secure phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Viktor Petrov, a former Russian intelligence operative who now worked as a freelance consultant.
"Victor," she said when he answered.
"It's Sarah. I need to ask you about Montenegro, specifically about a facility in the mountains." 3 hours later, Sarah sat in a dimly lit coffee shop in Georgetown, across from a man whose weathered face told the story of 30 years in some of the world's most dangerous places. Viktor Petrov had fingers stained yellow from cigarettes and eyes that missed nothing. "You're talking about Facility 7, Victor said, stirring sugar into his black coffee. "Very bad place, Sarah. Very bad people running it." "I need to get inside," she said simply. Victor's spoon stopped moving. He studied her face for a long moment, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. He found neither. "The Americans, they will not authorize this?" "The Americans think I'm too weak for the job." A slow smile spread across Victor's face. "Ah yes, I see. And so you will show them how wrong they are." Something like that. Victor leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through possibilities. "It can be done, but not the way your colonel would do it. Not with guns blazing and helicopters. It would require finesse, intelligence, patience. All things I have." "Yes," Victor agreed. "All things you have." Over the next 2 hours, Victor outlined a plan so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that anyone else would have dismissed it as fantasy. But as Sarah listened, she felt pieces clicking into place in her mind like a complex puzzle finally being solved. The plan relied on 3 key elements: timing, misdirection, and the fundamental human tendency to underestimate what they didn't understand. It would require her to enter the facility not as an enemy, but as something else entirely. Something so innocuous, so beneath suspicion, that the guards would never see her coming. "There is one problem," Victor warned as they prepared to leave. "Once you begin this, there is no backup, no support, no rescue if things go wrong. If you are caught, you will disappear just like those 23 prisoners." Sarah thought about Reed's words, about the laughter in his voice when he called her weak. She thought about the families of those prisoners waiting for news that might never come. She thought about her own family, about the strength that flowed through her veins like an underground river, hidden but unstoppable. "I understand," she said. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment overlooking the Potomac River. On her coffee table lay everything she would need: false documents, a cover story, contact information for local assets, and a small device that Victor had given her with strict instructions about when and how to use it. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Martinez. "Reed chose his team. They ship out tomorrow night. I tried to convince him, but you know how he is," Sarah typed back. "Thank you for trying. I hope they succeed." But even as she sent the message, Sarah was already changing into dark clothes and checking her equipment. She had booked a red-eye flight to Prague, connecting through to Podgorica. By the time Reed's team was getting their final briefing, she would already be on the ground in Montenegro, beginning a mission that would either free 23 innocent people or get her killed. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror one last time. The woman staring back at her looked exactly the same as always. Small, unassuming, easily overlooked. But behind her eyes burned something new. Something that hadn't been there that morning in the briefing room. Reed had called her weak. In less than 40 hours, she would prove him catastrophically wrong. As her plane lifted off from Dulles International Airport, Sarah Chen closed her eyes and began mentally rehearsing every step of what she was about to attempt. She thought about her training, about all the skills she had developed, not through brute force, but through careful observation and patient practice. She thought about the prisoners waiting in their cells, probably believing that no one was coming for them. They were wrong. Someone was coming. Someone whom their captors would never suspect, someone whose greatest strength lay in being constantly underestimated. The weak little woman from the briefing room was about to become their worst nightmare. The mountain air was thin and cold as Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the forest, looking down at Facility 7 through high-powered binoculars. 28 hours had passed since Reed's humiliating dismissal, and every minute had been spent in careful preparation. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness of a Tuesday morning, she was about to attempt something that even Victor had called borderline insane. The facility looked exactly as the satellite images had shown, a concrete fortress built into the mountainside, surrounded by 3 layers of fencing topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, their searchlights sweeping the perimeter in predictable patterns. From the outside, it appeared impenetrable. But Sarah wasn't planning to go through the outside. She checked her watch, 4:47 a.m. local time. In 13 minutes, a supply truck from the village would begin its weekly journey up the mountain road. The driver, Mikhail Volkov, had been delivering bread and vegetables to the facility for 3 years. He was also desperately in debt to several dangerous people, which made him remarkably cooperative when Victor's associates explained how he could earn enough money to solve his problems permanently. Sarah moved through the forest like a shadow, using skills she had learned not in CIA training facilities, but during childhood camping trips with her grandfather, a former Army Ranger who had taught her that the best way to avoid being seen was to become part of the landscape itself. Her dark clothing blended with the shadows between the trees, and her soft footsteps made no more sound than falling leaves. At exactly 5 a.m., she heard the rumble of the supply truck's engine. Mikhail was punctual, just as Victor had promised. Sarah waited until the truck rounded a sharp curve, then stepped into the road with her hands raised, playing the part of a stranded hiker. Mikhail hit the brakes, his face pale with fear. He had been expecting her, but the reality of what he was about to do terrified him more than his creditors ever could. "Please," Sarah said in perfect Russian, her voice trembling with manufactured fear. "My car broke down. I've been walking all night." For the benefit of anyone who might be monitoring radio communications, Mikhail played his part perfectly. "Get in," he said gruffly, "but stay quiet. This is a restricted area." Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, immediately noticing the false bottom that Victor's people had installed in the truck's cargo area. In 30 minutes, she would be hiding in that cramped space, surrounded by crates of vegetables and breathing through a carefully concealed air tube. For now, though, she needed to transform herself into someone completely different. As the truck wound its way up the mountain road, Sarah worked quickly. Out came the brown contact lenses that changed her eye color, the subtle prosthetics that altered the shape of her nose and cheekbones, and the grey wig that made her look 20 years older. By the time they reached the facility's outer checkpoint, Agent Sarah Chen had vanished entirely, replaced by Elena Kozlov, a middle-aged kitchen worker whose documentation was flawless because it was real. Victor had simply borrowed the identity of a woman who looked remarkably similar and was currently vacationing in Spain. The guards at the checkpoint were young, bored, and more interested in their coffee than in thoroughly examining papers they had seen dozens of times before. They glanced at Sarah's identification, noted that she was listed as a temporary replacement for a regular worker who had called in sick, and waved the truck through without a second thought. Phase 1 was complete. The truck rumbled through the facility's outer courtyard, past guard posts and administrative buildings, toward the kitchen entrance at the rear of the main structure. Sarah counted 17 guards in her field of vision, noting their positions and equipment with the precision of someone who had studied this place until she could navigate it blindfolded. 2 minutes, Mikhail whispered as they approached the kitchen loading dock. Sarah nodded, slipping out of the passenger seat and into the hidden compartment in the cargo area. The space was cramped and airless, but she had endured worse during survival training. As the truck stopped and she heard voices speaking in Serbian, she controlled her breathing and mentally reviewed the next phase of her plan. The kitchen workers who unloaded the truck were expecting Elena Kozlov. They had been told she was a temporary replacement, and like the guards, they were too busy with their own concerns to pay much attention to one more middle-aged woman in grey coveralls. Sarah emerged from her hiding place with her back to the facility's security cameras, helping to carry crates of vegetables into the kitchen as if she had been doing this job for years. Kitchen duty was the perfect cover for someone who needed to move through a secure facility without attracting attention. Food had to be delivered to every part of the complex: the guard stations, the administrative offices, and most importantly, the underground levels where the prisoners were held. As Elena Kozlov wheeled a cart laden with lunch trays through the facility's corridors, No one looked twice at her, but Sarah was looking at everything. She memorized the locations of security cameras, noted which guards seemed alert and which appeared to be going through the motions, and most crucially, she observed the electronic lock system that controlled access to the lower levels. Each door required a keycard and a 4-digit code. The cards were carried by senior guards, but the codes were changed weekly and known only to the facility commander and his deputy. At 1:30 p.m., Sarah delivered lunch to the guard station that controlled the main entrance to the underground levels. 2 guards sat behind bulletproof glass, their attention focused on a small television showing a soccer match. They barely glanced up as she set their food on a pass-through tray. "Thank you, babushka," one of them said dismissively, using the Russian word for grandmother, babushka. There it was again, the assumption that because she looked like an elderly kitchen worker, she was harmless, invisible, weak. Sarah smiled sweetly and shuffled away, but not before she had noted the keycard clipped to the duty officer's belt and memorized the number sequence he entered on the access panel. 7, 4, 1, 9. 3 hours later, during the facility's shift change, chaos erupted in the guard room. The soccer match on television was interrupted by breaking news of a terrorist attack in Belgrade. Guards clustered around the screen, shouting questions and theories about what had happened. No one noticed the elderly kitchen worker who had returned to collect their empty lunch trays. No one saw her reach through the pass-through window and gently lift the keycard from the distracted guard's belt. The attack in Belgrade was fictional, of course, a carefully orchestrated piece of electronic warfare that Victor's hackers had inserted into the local television feed. It would be discovered and corrected within an hour, but for now, it provided exactly the distraction Sarah needed. She made her way to a utility closet she had identified earlier. One located directly above the entrance to the underground levels. From her bag, she withdrew tools that looked like kitchen utensils but were actually precision instruments, designed for a very different purpose. Working quickly and silently, she removed a section of ceiling tile and lowered herself into the space between floors. The facility's blueprints, which she had studied obsessively, showed that this area contained the main electrical conduits for the security system. Sarah located the specific cables that powered the cameras monitoring the entrance to the lower levels. With surgical precision, she spliced in a small device that Victor had provided, a loop recorder that would show the security monitors exactly what they expected to see while hiding what was actually happening. 20 minutes later, Elena Kozlov emerged from the utility closet, looking slightly dusty but otherwise unremarkable. She made her way to the guard station where the fabricated news report was still dominating everyone's attention. "Excuse me," she said in accented English, her voice quavering like that of a nervous old woman. "I dropped my cleaning supplies down the stairs to the lower level. May I go retrieve them?" The distracted guard waved her through without even looking at her. "Make it quick, babushka, and stay out of the restricted areas." Sarah swiped the stolen keycard and entered the code she had memorized. The heavy steel door clicked open, and she stepped into the underground complex that held 23 innocent people who had given up hope of ever seeing sunlight again. The lower level was a maze of concrete corridors lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. Sarah moved carefully, her soft shoes silent on the polished floor. She could hear voices echoing from the guard stations, rough laughter, and the sound of cards being shuffled. Night shift guards playing poker to pass the time while their prisoners rotted in cells just yards away. She found the first cell block after 5 minutes of careful exploration. Through the narrow window in the steel door, she could see a man sitting on a thin mattress, staring at the wall with the hollow expression of someone whose spirit had been nearly broken. This was Dr. Alexander Petkovic, a Serbian journalist who had been investigating government corruption when he disappeared 6 months ago. Sarah tapped softly on the glass. The man looked up, confusion replacing despair in his eyes as he saw what appeared to be a cleaning woman standing in the corridor. She held a finger to her lips and mouthed silently, "American, I'm here to help." The transformation in Dr. Petkovic's face was immediate and complete. Hope blazed in his eyes like a flame suddenly given oxygen. He nodded vigorously and pointed down the corridor, indicating where the other prisoners could be found. For the next hour, Sarah moved through the underground complex like a ghost, identifying and making contact with each of the 23 prisoners. There were journalists and activists, teachers and lawyers, even a Catholic priest who had spoken out against human trafficking. All of them had committed the same crime. They had refused to remain silent in the face of injustice. Each prisoner received the same message. Tomorrow at 3 a.m., during the shift change, their cell doors would open. They were to move quickly and silently to the eastern stairwell, where they would be led to freedom. Anyone who made noise or failed to follow instructions exactly would endanger everyone else. As Sarah prepared to leave the underground level, she encountered her first real challenge. A guard had left his station early and was walking down the corridor directly toward her. There was no place to hide, no innocent explanation for why a kitchen worker would be in this area at this time of night. For a split second, panic threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. This was the moment Reed had warned about, when theory met reality, when careful planning collided with the unpredictable chaos of human behavior. This was when she was supposed to freeze up, to reveal the weakness he had seen in her. Instead, Sarah did something that would have surprised everyone who thought they knew her. She attacked. The guard, a large man who probably outweighed her by 80 pounds, never saw it coming. One moment he was walking down the corridor thinking about his girlfriend back home, and the next he was on the ground with Sarah's arm around his throat, cutting off the blood flow to his brain with a sleeper hold. She had learned not from CIA training but from her older brother, who had been a high school wrestling champion. The guard struggled for perhaps 15 seconds before unconsciousness claimed him. Sarah dragged his body into an empty supply closet, bound him with zip ties, and gagged him with his own sock. He would have a headache when he woke up, but he would live. Unlike some of the people who worked in this facility, Sarah Chen took no pleasure in causing unnecessary harm. She took the guard's radio and weapon, hiding both in her bag along with the stolen keycard. Then she made her way back through the facility, past the poker playing guards, past the security cameras that showed only what her electronic deception wanted them to show. Elena Kozlov finished her shift at 10 p.m., collecting her pay and saying goodbye to the kitchen supervisor, who had barely noticed her presence. She climbed into Mikhail's truck for the journey back down the mountain, once again becoming Sarah Chen, as the facility's lights disappeared behind them. But Sarah's work was far from over. The hardest part, the actual rescue, was still 15 hours away. And unlike everything she had accomplished so far, the next phase could not be done silently or invisibly. Tomorrow, the weak little woman would have to become something else entirely. Tomorrow, she would have to become dangerous. At exactly 2:47 a.m. on Thursday morning, 43 hours after Colonel Reed had called her weak, Sarah Chen crouched in the forest surrounding Facility 7 and prepared to do something that would be talked about in intelligence circles for decades to come. The rescue itself had to happen during the shift change, when the facility's security was at its most vulnerable. But getting 23 prisoners out of an underground complex and past multiple layers of security would require more than just good timing. It would require controlled chaos, a distraction so complete and overwhelming that every guard in the facility would be too busy responding to immediate threats to notice a group of people moving through the shadows. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Victor's associates had provided her with tools that were both sophisticated and devastatingly effective. Small explosive charges designed to disable vehicles without killing their occupants, smoke grenades that would create impenetrable visual barriers, and signal jammers that would turn the facility's sophisticated communications equipment into expensive paperweights. But her most important weapon was something no amount of training could provide: the absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing.
At 2:55 a.m., Sarah activated the signal jammer hidden in her backpack.
Throughout Facility 7, radios went silent, cell phones lost their signals, and landline telephones produced only dead air when lifted from their cradles. The guards on duty noticed the communication blackout immediately, but their training told them to maintain their positions until they could determine what was causing the problem. That was their first mistake. At exactly 3 a.m., as the night shift guards began moving toward their relief positions, Sarah's carefully placed explosive charges detonated simultaneously. The facility's generator building erupted in flames, plunging half the complex into darkness. 2 guard towers lost power completely, their searchlights going black at the moment when visibility was most critical. The explosion also destroyed the main electrical panel for the cell block doors, causing every electronic lock in the underground level to fail open, a feature Sarah had discovered while studying the facility's schematics. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the complex, casting everything in an eerie red glow that turned familiar corridors into alien landscapes. In the chaos that followed, as guards shouted orders that no one could hear over their dead radios and stumbled through smoke-filled hallways, 23 prisoners stepped out of their cells into freedom for the first time in months. Dr. Petkovic, the Serbian journalist who had become the unofficial leader of the prisoners, moved quickly through the underground corridors. Gathering his fellow captives according to the plan Sarah had whispered to him 18 hours earlier. There was no time for celebration, no moment of joy at their unexpected liberation. Survival depended on moving fast and staying quiet. Above ground, Sarah had become something that none of the guards were prepared to handle. A phantom who struck without warning and disappeared before anyone could respond. She moved through the chaos like smoke, using the darkness and confusion to devastating effect. When a group of guards attempted to restore power to the main building, they found their path blocked by smoke grenades that filled the corridor with impenetrable grey clouds. When backup generators were brought online, they mysteriously failed within minutes, their fuel lines cut by someone who seemed to understand exactly how the facility's systems worked. But Sarah's greatest advantage was still the same, one she had possessed in that briefing room 43 hours earlier. No one expected her to be capable of what she was doing. The guards searching for saboteurs were looking for a team of elite special forces operatives. They expected to face heavily armed commandos who would engage them in direct firefights. What they found instead was a small woman in dark clothing who seemed to appear and disappear at will, striking with surgical precision before melting back into the shadows. When Sergeant Kozlovsky, the facility's senior guard, finally cornered what he thought was the intruder in the motor pool, he was expecting to capture or kill a dangerous terrorist. Instead, he found himself facing someone who looked like she might work in an office building or teach elementary school. "You," he said in disbelief, his English heavily accented but clear. "You are the one doing this?" Sarah stood perfectly still in the red emergency lighting, her hands empty and visible. She looked small, unthreatening, exactly like the kind of person Kozlovsky might pass on the street without a second glance. "My name is Sarah Chen," she said calmly. "I'm an agent of the United States Central Intelligence Agency, and you're going to let me and those prisoners walk out of here." Kozlovsky laughed, the sound echoing off the concrete walls. "You think you can make demands? You think because you set off some firecrackers and shut down our power that you are in control here?" He was a large man, trained in combat and accustomed to intimidating others through sheer physical presence. He had interrogated hardened criminals and broken trained soldiers. A small American woman should have been trembling with fear. Instead, Sarah simply nodded towards the shadows behind him. "I think you should look around, Sergeant." For the first time, Kozlovsky became aware of figures moving in the darkness behind him. Dr. Petkovich stepped into the emergency lighting, followed by Maria Santos, a Spanish human rights lawyer, who had spent 4 months in an underground cell. One by one, all 23 prisoners emerged from the shadows, moving with the quiet determination of people who had nothing left to lose. "Impossible," Kozlovsky whispered. "The cells, the locks." "Electronic locks," Sarah explained patiently. "They fail open when the main power system is compromised. It's a safety feature designed to prevent prisoners from being trapped during fires or other emergencies. I'm surprised your engineers never mentioned that detail." But even as she spoke, Sarah could hear the sound of boots on concrete as more guards converged on their position. The facility's backup communication system had finally come online, and orders were being shouted throughout the complex. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the motor pool would be surrounded. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her voice carrying an authority that made even Kozlovsky hesitate. "You're going to radio your remaining guards and tell them to stand down. Then you're going to open the main gate and allow us to leave. In return, no one else gets hurt. And if I refuse?" Sarah's expression never changed, but something in her eyes made the veteran guard take an involuntary step backward. "Then I stopped playing nice." The threat was delivered so quietly, so matter-of-factly, that it took Kozlovsky a moment to process what he had heard. When understanding finally dawned, he realized that the explosions and power failures he had attributed to luck or amateur sabotage had been planned with military precision. This small woman had single-handedly neutralized a facility that housed some of the most dangerous prisoners in Eastern Europe. "You are bluffing," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Sarah reached into her jacket and withdrew a small device that looked like a television remote control. "This facility has a natural gas line that runs beneath the main building," she said conversationally. "I've placed charges along that line at 3 critical points. If I press this button, the resulting explosion will level everything within 100 meters. Kozlovsky's face went pale. "You would kill yourself and all the prisoners." "Would I?" Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Are you willing to bet their lives on your ability to read my psychological profile correctly?" For 30 seconds, the motor pool was silent except for the distant sounds of guards searching other parts of the facility. Kozlovsky stared at the small woman who had appeared from nowhere and destroyed everything he thought he understood about security and control. Finally, he reached for his radio. "This is Kozlovsky. Stand down. All units, stand down and return to perimeter positions." The confused voices that responded over the radio were speaking rapid Serbian, but their tone made their questions clear. Kozlovsky answered briefly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "I told them we're conducting a training exercise," he said.
"It will not fool them for long." "It doesn't need to," Sarah replied. "Just long enough for us to reach the gate."
The procession that made its way through Facility 7 at 3:27 a.m. was unlike anything the remaining guards had ever seen.
23 former prisoners walked in a tight formation, their heads high despite months of captivity and abuse. At their center moved a small woman who seemed to radiate calm confidence, as if leading midnight prison breaks was something she did every weekend. The main gate guards, following Kozlovsky's orders, opened the massive steel barriers without question. As the group passed through into the mountain darkness, several of the liberated prisoners looked back at the facility that had held them captive for so long. "Don't look back," Sarah advised quietly. "Look forward. Your families are waiting." They walked for 3 hours through the mountain forests, following paths that Victor had mapped weeks earlier. Just as dawn was breaking over the peaks, they reached a clearing where 2 helicopters waited with their rotors already spinning. The pilots were Americans, members of a CIA extraction team that had been positioned just in case Reed's official mission ran into trouble. They had been waiting for hours, expecting to pick up wounded operators from a failed assault on the facility. Instead, they found themselves facing 23 former prisoners and a single agent who looked like she had just finished a pleasant evening stroll. Captain Williams, the lead pilot, stared at Sarah in amazement.
"Agent Chen, where's the extraction team?"
"There is no extraction team," Sarah replied, helping an elderly prisoner climb aboard the first helicopter.
"Just us. But the facility, the guards..." "How did you get them all out?" Sarah paused in the helicopter doorway and looked back towards the mountains, where smoke was still rising from Facility 7. Somewhere in that maze of concrete and steel, Colonel Reed's hand-picked team was probably preparing for an assault that was no longer necessary. "I asked politely," she said. 6 hours later, Sarah Chen stood in the same CIA briefing room where her journey had begun. The 23 former prisoners had been debriefed, medically examined, and were already making phone calls to families who had thought they were dead. International news organizations were calling it the most successful hostage rescue operation in recent history. Colonel Reed sat at the same polished oak table, but his expression was very different from what it had been 46 hours earlier. The man who had called her weak now couldn't meet her eyes. "The facility commander is claiming his installation was hit by a team of at least 20 operatives," Reed said quietly. "Military-trained specialists with sophisticated equipment and inside intelligence." Sarah nodded. That's probably what it felt like from his perspective. "Sarah," Reed began, then stopped. He seemed to be struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone who had spent his career giving orders rather than admitting mistakes. "Yes, Colonel."
I owe you an apology.
"I was wrong about your capabilities. Completely wrong." Sarah considered his words for a moment. In the past 46 hours, she had infiltrated a black site facility, disabled its security systems, freed 23 prisoners, and escaped without firing a single shot or causing any permanent injuries. She had accomplished something that Reed's planned assault might not have achieved even with a full team of operators. But more than that, she had proved something to herself about the difference between perceived weakness and actual strength. "Apology accepted, Colonel," she said. "But I have a question for you. Anything. When you looked at me in this room 2 days ago, what exactly did you see?"
Reed was quiet for a long time, considering his answer carefully.
"I saw someone small and quiet, someone who seemed uncertain, maybe a little fragile. I saw..." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the admission he was about to make. "I saw what I expected to see based on my own assumptions. And what do you see now?" Reed looked at her directly for the first time since she had entered the room. "I see someone who taught me that the most dangerous operative is the one nobody suspects. I see someone who understands that real strength isn't about being the biggest or the loudest or the most aggressive person in the room." Sarah smiled, the same quiet smile she had worn when walking out of this room 46 hours earlier. But now Reed understood what he had missed before. It wasn't the smile of someone who was weak or uncertain. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of and was simply waiting for the right moment to prove it. Thank you, Colonel. That means more than you know. As Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave, Agent Martinez approached her. So what's next for you? I imagine after this you can write your own ticket anywhere in the agency. Sarah thought about the question seriously. She thought about the 23 people who were now free because someone had refused to accept that their captivity was inevitable. She thought about all the other people in the world who were waiting for someone to prove that the impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. I think, she said finally, I'd like to stay in the field. There's a lot of work to do out there. End of quote. Track has been created by Der Business's family business and industry manager. When our temperature's being created, borning of the decision between Stingming TV and disadvantages, and that's our way that notes of that. Track is being created by the most security earth. But Sarah Chen knew the truth was simpler than any legend. She hadn't succeeded because she was stronger than everyone expected or more skilled than her training suggested. She had succeeded because she understood something that her critics never would. The greatest weapon any person possesses isn't their ability to intimidate others. It's their willingness to be underestimated by those who think they know what strength looks like. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone assumes is harmless. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not by those who look like warriors, but by those who understand that true power comes from knowing yourself completely, your limitations and your capabilities, your fears and your courage. And sometimes, when someone calls you weak, the best response isn't to argue. It's to smile, walk away, and then show them exactly how wrong they were.